Hi, everybody. Tonight, we drift gently into the flickering candlelit world of the medieval Inquisitors. A life marked not by zeal and fury, as legend often tells, but by heavy silences, cold cloisters, and a burdened soul. This is the tale of Brother Anselm, a quiet man of parchment and pen, who walked the path of the Inquisition not for power, but for peace of mind in a world trembling under the weight of heresy, war, and plague. In this long and winding story, we shall journey through 22 parts, tracing every stone of his journey, through cloistered halls, shadowed villages, and the depths of his own conscience. Let us begin. The winter of 1307 in the Kingdom of France had been long and cruel. Frost clung to the bark of ancient trees, and thin smoke curled from the chimneys of moss-capped cottages. In the quiet abbey of St. Roch, nestled deep in the Burgundian hills, a man sat hunched beneath a high-arched window, his ink-stained fingers trembling in the bitter cold. Brother Anselm, no longer young but not yet old, turned a page in the worn vellum codex before him. His eyes, the gray of slate, moved slowly over each line, not reading but remembering. By then, he had served as Inquisitor for 12 years. 12 winters. 12 springs where the blood of inquiry often mingled with the sweetness of blooming violets. The fire in the scriptorium hearth had gone out hours ago, but he did not stir to relight it. Silence was warmer. Silence and the thick quiet of thought. A mouse skittered across the stone floor, unseen but heard. In his mind's eye, Anselm still stood in the dusty square of Carcassonne, watching a barefoot girl of 16 being tied to a stake. Not for theft, nor for murder, but for owning a book in Occitan, her mother's psalter, inherited from a time before the bishop's ban. She had kissed it softly before the flames rose, and Anselm, he had been the one to seal the verdict. He had not lit the fire, but he had not stopped it. That night, as snow laced the monastery's steep roof, he reached for his quill and began to write. Not doctrine, not decree, but a memory. His hand moved slowly, as though the ink itself might judge him. I was born in the village of Verdun-sur-Meuse, he wrote, in a time of famine to a cobbler's widow. My mother taught me the Ave Maria before she died of fever. I was taken in by the monks of Saint Lazare. I learned Latin before I could count sheep. The words steadied him. He would not sleep that night. He seldom did. The abbey bell rang tertiae in the dark, too early, too cold for any brother to heed. Still, Anselm closed his inkpot and wrapped his rough woolen cloak tighter about him. He walked the length of the silent corridor, pausing once to press his fingers against the cold stone of a narrow lancet window. Outside, the wind had risen. A storm was coming, but not of snow. No, the letter had arrived 2 days past, bearing the seal of the Archbishop of Narbonne. Another summons, another journey south, another heresy to chase through the villages of Languedoc, where the Cathars once walked, and where whispers of old beliefs still lingered in hearth ash and cellar shadows. He had not told the other brothers. Not yet. For how does one explain the quiet dread that settles in the bones when duty calls you to break what you once sought to protect? At dawn, he descended to the crypt beneath the chapel. The bones of long-dead abbots rested there, cradled in stone niches. He knelt before the oldest tomb and whispered a prayer not found in any canon. Lord, grant me not strength, but mercy. Grant me not clarity, but peace. His breath rose in small clouds. The tomb gave no answer. By the time the first rooster crowed, he was on the road. His satchel held a single change of robes, a rosary, and the letter of summons. He carried no weapons, only his voice, his seal, and the authority of the church. And yet, in the hearts of those he would meet, he would be feared more than any knight. The road wound through frost-laced fields, past villages silent as the grave. Once, he paused to share bread with a peddler bound north. The man asked if he was a healer. Anselm only nodded. It was close enough to truth. By the time he reached the border of Languedoc, the air had changed. It was warmer here, tinged with the scent of rosemary and wood smoke. Old songs lingered in the wind, songs that once spoke of spirit and light, now banned as heresy. In a town called Bedtime, he stopped for the night at a small priory. The prior, a bent man with eyes like melted wax, welcomed him with trembling reverence. They say the heretics speak in tongues, the prior whispered over lentils and rye bread. They gather in cellars, women and children too. Anselm nodded. He did not correct him. He had heard it before. Always the same tales, whispers, never proof, but sometimes whispers were enough. That night, as he lay on a straw mattress, the voice of the girl from Carcassonne came to him again. "I only wanted to read the Psalms," she had said, tears tracing soot on her cheeks. "Is that so wrong, Father?" He had no answer then. He had none now. The moon rose high above the Pyrenees, casting long silver shadows through the open window. Somewhere beyond the hills his next charge awaited. He turned onto his side and tried to remember his mother's face, but it had been too long. All he could see now was firelight and the girl's eyes as the flames began to rise. Sleep did not come, only the wind, and so the journey began again. The morning sun broke pale and uncertain over the tiled roofs of Bedtime, casting a thin veil of light across the silent fields beyond. Brother Anselm stood alone beside a frost-cracked well, his breath rising in slow wisps as he turned the Archbishop's letter over in his hand. Its words, inked in the sharp, confident Latin of a high scribe, danced before his weary eyes. "You are to inquire into the village of Saint Antonin. There are reports of liturgical deviations and gatherings beyond church oversight. Proceed with discretion and severity, as befits your station." Discretion and severity. Always those words. The priory's bell called prime, but Anselm did not stay. With his cloak drawn close, he took the narrow path eastward, boots crunching over frost-hardened dirt. St. Antonin lay beyond the ridgeline, 5 days' walk through low valleys and crooked forest roads, the kind where old beliefs curled like ivy around the trunks of time. He passed only 2 travelers on the road that day, a shepherd boy leading a thin flock of ewes, and a silent man driving an ox cart full of cider barrels. Neither spoke to him. His robe gave him away. His presence brought unease, even among the faithful. That night, he rested beneath an ancient oak whose limbs stretched like the arms of a weary sentinel. There, he unwrapped a small, dark loaf of bread, crumbled some dried fig into it, and chewed in silence. He did not pray before sleeping. His prayers had long become quiet thoughts, unspoken, directed more toward memory than heaven. The dreams came again. Not of fire this time, but of water. He stood at the edge of a wide river, watching faceless pilgrims drift by on barges made of bone. Each bore a book clutched to their breast, and each looked to him with wordless expectation. He reached for them, but they dissolved into mist before he could speak. When he awoke, his eyes were damp. On the 3rd day, he came upon a chapel in ruin. Ivy wound through the shattered windows, and the altar had collapsed under years of disuse. Anselm entered cautiously. Dust rose with each step. In the chancel lay scattered fragments of colored glass, once a window depicting St. Agnes, now a jigsaw of forgotten grace. He knelt, not to pray, but to listen. Beneath the stillness, he could feel it, that strange tremble in the soul, the kind that whispered someone remembers what once was. Tucked behind the broken altar was a wooden box, its lid carved with unfamiliar symbols, neither Latin nor Greek, but something older. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay a small book. He turned its pages gently. No title, no signature, only verses in Occitan, hymns of praise, soft poems to light and wind, songs of the Cathars. He closed the book and held it for a long while. He should have burned it. Instead, he wrapped it again and placed it deep in his satchel. That night, he did not sleep. He sat with his back against the chapel wall, listening to the wind sigh through the trees. He thought of the girl again and of the fire, and then of the book in his bag, fragile, forbidden, beautiful. On the 4th day, he reached the outskirts of St. Antonin. Smoke rose in thin trails from hearths, and the fields were dotted with pale-limbed scarecrows. Children watched him from doorways, eyes wide and unblinking. The innkeeper's wife refused him at first. "We have no room," she muttered, drying her hands on her apron, "and no need for inquiries." "I ask only for bread and a bench," he replied softly, "and perhaps news." She studied him. He saw the moment her resistance faltered, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "There is a cot in the stable," she said at last. "I'll bring broth." He nodded, grateful. The stable smelled of hay and damp stone. He lit a candle stub and sat upon the cot, its straw filling uneven and sharp. As promised, the woman brought a bowl of lentil broth and a crust of rye bread. She lingered longer than needed, her hands twitching at her apron. "They say you're here about the gatherings," she said finally, not meeting his gaze. "I am here to listen," he replied. She snorted softly. "You'll hear nothing but wind and superstition." "Still," he said, "tell me what you know." She hesitated, then sat upon an overturned crate, speaking in low tones. 3 nights a week in the cellar of the weaver's house. No candles, no chanting. They just sit in silence, holding hands. Sometimes they speak, but not like priests. More like old tales. Some say they call it la lumière. The light, Anselm murmured, the Cathar term. He had heard it before. They heal the sick, she continued. They feed the hungry. That's all, but they do it without the church. And there it was, the core of heresy. Not the acts, but the independence. He thanked her quietly and watched as she returned to the house, shoulders hunched against the cold. That night, Anselm did not approach the weaver's home. He waited. He watched the flicker of shadows through narrow slits in the shutters, listened for hymns that never came, only stillness, only silence. The next day, he made himself known to the village priest, a red-faced man named Father Gilles. The priest offered him wine and too much talk. Blasphemers, the lot of them, Gilles said, wiping grease from his chin. Too clever by half, these peasants. Think they know scripture better than Rome. They quote things not in Latin, but in their cursed tongue. Have you confronted them? Gilles waved a hand. I've sent word to Toulouse. They'll send soldiers, or perhaps fire. Anselm's jaw tightened. That is not the way. The priest blinked. Is it not your way? Anselm stood. My way is to seek truth, not smoke. That evening, he walked alone through the narrow lanes of Saint-Antonin, his footsteps muffled by old straw and damp earth. He did not question, did not accuse. He simply watched and waited. At the edge of the village stood a grove of yew trees, their limbs gnarled and heavy. Beneath them, someone had arranged a circle of stones. No markings, no symbols, just a space, sacred somehow, without pretense. He sat among the stones as night fell. The stars blinked to life above him, and the wind whispered in the boughs. There, in the hush of the yews, Brother Anselm felt something stir. Not heresy, not evil, but memory. A thread of something ancient, quiet, and kind, and it frightened him more than fire ever had. By the morning of the 5th day, the mist had settled low over Saint-Antonin, draping the village in a shroud of quiet. Brother Anselm rose early, the stable's chill clinging to his bones like a second skin. He wrapped his cloak tightly and stepped into the gray light, drawn once more to the yew grove beyond the village boundary. No one followed him, but he sensed eyes, always, behind shutters, beyond fences, above in windows where linens hung still and forgotten. He was a stranger, yes, but more than that. His presence pressed against the daily rhythm of this place, like a stone dropped into a still basin of water. At the grove, the circle of stones remained unchanged. Dew beaded on their moss-covered surfaces, glinting like tears in the dim light. He knelt beside the largest and placed a hand upon it. Cool, ancient, unyielding. In that silence, he whispered again, not a prayer, but a question. Why do you gather? The wind answered with a sigh through the yews. Behind him, footsteps crunched. He turned slowly. A woman stood at the edge of the grove, wrapped in a coarse wool shawl. Her face was lined not with age, but with long hours of labor and worry. Her eyes, hazel and steady, met his without fear. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. Nor should you, he replied. A smile touched her lips, brief and faint. Then we are well matched. She stepped into the grove and sat opposite him, hands folded in her lap. I am called Miriam, she said. I weave linen. Brother Anselm, he replied. I know who you are. There was no hostility in her voice, only understanding. You've come to judge us, she said. I've come to listen. She tilted her head. Few in your robe ever do. He let the silence stretch. Then, do you speak heresy? She chuckled softly. What is heresy to a weaver? We speak of light, of the spirit. We share bread and care for the sick. We do not deny Christ. We only wish to see him without veils. He studied her. You speak like a perfect. Her smile faded. No, we are none of us perfect. Only tired. Tired of fear. Tired of rules made by men far away who have never milked a goat or buried a child. The wind stirred again. Birds called from the trees. You are not afraid of me, he said. I am, she whispered. But not in the way you think. I fear what you carry, not your seal, not your title, but your sorrow. That struck deeper than he expected. She rose then, brushing her skirt. Come tonight, she said. See what we are. And she left him there, heart heavier than when he had arrived. That evening, he waited until the village lamps had dimmed, until only the hush of night remained. Then, with cloak drawn close and steps light as fallen leaves, he approached the weaver's house. A lantern glowed faintly behind the drawn shutters. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Softer. The door creaked open. Miriam stood there, candle in hand. She said nothing, only stepped aside to let him in. The room was small, warm, filled with the scent of dried herbs and wool. Along the walls were simple tapestries. No saints, no symbols, only patterns, spirals, vines, stars. She led him down a narrow stair to the cellar. There, in the low-ceiling space lit by beeswax candles, a dozen people sat in a circle. Men, women, 2 children. None stood when he entered. None looked away. One by one, they reached for each other's hands until the circle was whole again. Miriam joined them. Anselm stood at the edge, heart pounding. He expected chanting, confession, doctrine, but there was none, only silence. A deep golden silence that settled into the bones like old hymns. Minutes passed, perhaps more. Then a man spoke, not loudly, not as if preaching. "My son is ill," he said. "The healer came. She gave him herbs, but still he cries at night. I don't know what to do." A woman across the circle nodded. "I will bring elderflower and sit with him if you wish." Another voice spoke of loneliness, another of a dream. There was no interruption, only listening, only gentle assent. Then Miriam turned to Anselm. He froze. "You may speak too," she said. He shook his head, but his lips parted. "I saw a girl burn," he whispered. "She had a book. She wanted to read the Psalms. I did not stop it." No one replied, no one condemned. But neither did they look away. Tears gathered behind his eyes, unbidden. "We are not here to condemn," Miriam said softly. "We are here to remember, to carry the burdens no one else will." He sat down then, and for the first time in many years, Anselm felt the strange, painful weight of being known. He left before dawn. The stars were still bright as he stepped into the cold. He returned to the stable and sat upon the cot, unmoving, until morning light seeped through the thatch. His duty had not changed, but something within him had shifted, like a river finding a new bend. In the days that followed, he did not send word to the archbishop. He did not summon guards or pen a verdict. Instead, he remained in Saint-Antonin, observing, listening. He told the priest nothing. He wrote no names. In the quiet of night, he returned to the grove, to the cellar. He became, for a time, a shadow among them, and slowly the question grew louder in his heart. What is mercy, if not the courage to look beyond the fire? The days in Saint-Antonin passed not with haste, but with the slow grace of falling leaves. Spring whispered at the edges of winter's retreat, and the frost began to lift from the fields. Crocuses, pale and tentative, sprouted at the feet of old stone walls. Children played again in the narrow lanes, and the village stirred as though waking from a long, uneasy dream. Brother Anselm remained. He made no proclamations, drew no seals upon parchment. His robes, once sharp with ecclesiastical formality, now bore the creases and dust of a man who had lingered too long at the threshold of decision. Yet none in the village questioned his presence. His silence had become familiar. His eyes, though watchful, held no threat. He spent his mornings helping the old priest in the chapel, mending a cracked chalice, replacing the wax-dampened linens, reciting mass in a voice quiet as breath. Father Gilles, suspicious at first, grew to accept his company like one accepts the presence of fog, strange but not unwelcome. In the afternoons, Anselm walked the paths beyond the village, past orchards waking to blossom and sheep huddling under budding hawthorn. He seldom spoke. Instead, he listened. Not only to voices, but to the hum of bees, to the creak of old cartwheels, to the rustle of stories carried by wind through half-closed shutters. He was in truth waiting. Not for a sign, but for clarity. Each evening, he returned to the weaver's house. The gatherings had grown in number, not in people, but in spirit. What had once been simple sharing of burdens had begun to take shape as something more. Not a church, not a sect, but a space where souls were seen without veil. They read no scriptures aloud, but they spoke of love, of loss, of that ever-flickering light within the human chest. One night, an old man recited a poem, not in Latin, but in Occitan, the forbidden tongue of Southern poets. Lo jorn es clars, la luna luts, mas dins mon cor lo cel es muts. The day is bright, the moon gives light, but in my heart the sky is night. Anselm knew the words. They echoed something from his youth, before doctrine had bound his tongue. He said nothing, but the line clung to him. The day is bright, but in my heart. A week passed, then another. Still no word from Narbonne. He had not written them. He should have. And yet, each time he dipped his quill, some invisible hand stilled him. His notebook filled instead with observations, not accusations. Miriam speaks gently, even to those who doubt. She treats the fevers with rosemary and sings over the sick in a voice so soft I scarcely hear the words. Tonight, a boy recounted the death of his sister. He said he saw her soul in the stars. No one mocked him. I have not seen pride. I have not seen blasphemy. I have only seen weariness, met with grace. His words, had they been read by his superiors, would have condemned him, for he was no longer an inquisitor. Not truly. He had become a witness, and perhaps in some way a penitent. One morning, as dawn spilled gold over the hills, Anselm climbed the path behind the chapel. There stood a shrine, weathered and forgotten, dedicated to St. Julian the Hospitaller. Its paint had long since faded, its roof caved with moss. He sat beside it and closed his eyes. A memory came, unbidden. He was 12, barefoot in the monastery garden of Saint Lazare. The abbot had handed him a copy of Confessiones by St. Augustine. He had not understood it then, not truly. But one line had etched itself into his soul. Da quod ubis, et ube quod vis. Give what you command and command what you will. He had pondered it for years. Now, sitting among the wildflowers, he thought of that line again. And for the first time, he felt its weight not as doctrine, but as plea. Give me the grace to do what is asked of me, and ask only what I can bear. That night, Miriam approached him as the circle ended. You are troubled, she said, folding her shawl against the cool air. I am unraveling, he replied. She studied him. Then perhaps that is a mercy. Some cloth must be unmade before it can be mended. He looked at her then, not as a weaver of fabric, but of people. Do you believe in the church? He asked. She hesitated. I believe in Christ. I believe in compassion. If those dwell in the church, then yes. But I do not believe in fear. I do not believe in silence. He nodded slowly. Her hand brushed his arm. Whatever you decide, Brother Anselm, let it be born of mercy. The next morning, a messenger arrived. He wore the sigil of Toulouse. Anselm met him outside the chapel where the trees shivered in a sudden gust. The man, young and pale from travel, handed him a sealed scroll. It is urgent, he said. Anselm broke the wax. The letter was short. Brother Anselm, you are summoned to Toulouse for inquiry into your prolonged absence and lack of correspondence. Concerns have arisen. Present yourself within 7 days. No blessing, no signature, only order. He folded the letter and tucked it beneath his robe. The time had come, not for judgment, but for choice. And in that dawning hour, as the bells of Saint Antonin tolled matins, Brother Anselm finally understood. The light they spoke of, the heretics, the weavers, the poets, it was not a fire to burn away doubt. It was a candle to guide the broken home. The sky that morning bore the shade of tempered steel, heavy with unfallen rain. As the bells of Saint Antonin gave their low, solemn song across the mist-laced fields, Brother Anselm sat alone in the apse of the village chapel. The summons from Toulouse folded neatly in his lap. He had not yet told anyone. Not Miriam. Not Father Gilles. Not even the quiet figure of Saint Agnes, whose pale stone form stood sentinel behind the altar, her eyes cast downward as if in mourning. The candle before her flickered. Its light danced across her carved features, softening the stoic sorrow of her face. Anselm rose and bowed gently before her. He made no prayer, only a whisper. I do not know the road. Then he turned and stepped into the world again. The letter had given him 7 days. It would take 3 to reach Toulouse by the straightest road. But he did not leave that day, nor the next. Instead, he began to prepare, not for departure, but for the reckoning that lay beyond it. Each morning he walked the village, memorizing it as one memorizes a hymn, stone by stone, voice by voice. He visited the cobbler's boy, whose foot he had bandaged 2 weeks prior. He sat by the old shepherd woman, who no longer tended flocks but sang to them in dreams. He helped repair the shutters on the baker's cottage, laughed, truly laughed, when the youngest daughter spilled flour on his robes. In those small gestures, something inside him began to settle, not into peace, but into a kind of quiet readiness. And every evening he returned to the weaver's house. But on the 3rd night, the circle was not as he had left it. Miriam stood by the doorway, her face drawn tight with worry. There's been word, she said, from the next village. The bishop has sent a new investigator, young, ambitious. Anselm felt a chill pass through him. Do they know of this place? Not yet, but it will not take long. He nodded slowly. Then I must go. To Toulouse? She asked. He looked at her, eyes shadowed with something older than fear. To shield you, he said. She said nothing, but her hand found his. That was enough. On the morning of the 5th day, Brother Anselm left Saint-Antonin. The sky wept softly as he walked. A light, persistent rain that blurred the distant hills and turned the earth beneath his boots to soft, clinging mud. He carried little, his satchel, the Psalter in Occitan, a loaf of black bread wrapped in linen, and the letter. The road wound gently through valleys where vineyards lay bare and watchful. Birds moved in the hedgerows, flitting like old thoughts from branch to branch. He traveled alone, and yet he did not feel forsaken. He felt accompanied somehow, by memory, by quiet resolve, by the whispered hopes of a village that had, for a short season, seen mercy take form in a man they had once feared. On the 2nd night, he rested at a wayside shrine. No roof, just a cross carved into weathered stone, with ivy tangled like veins across its arms. There he lit a candle and read aloud from the Psalter. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. He closed the book and stared into the flickering flame. How many souls had he failed to save? How many had looked to him and found only silence? He had no answers, only footsteps forward. By the 6th day, the city of Toulouse rose before him, stone walls stained dark with age, towers reaching like fingers into the gray. Smoke curled from countless hearths, and the scent of wet stone and old parchment filled the air. He passed through the gate with little notice. No one stopped a pilgrim-looking man in worn robes. The inquisitorial court was housed in an old monastery near the river, a brooding structure with narrow windows and high, echoing halls. As he crossed the threshold, he felt the weight return. The air inside was thicker, tighter, as though judgment itself pressed against the very stones. He presented the letter to the scribe at the gate. The man scanned it, then nodded. You are expected. He was led through corridors of quiet dread, where monks whispered and guards watched from shadowed alcoves. Finally, he was shown to a chamber with tall windows and a single table. Wait here, the scribe said. Anselm sat. Time moved slowly in such places. Eventually, the door opened and a figure entered, a man younger than Anselm, robed in black, trimmed with scarlet, eyes sharp with certainty. Brother Anselm, he said, voice clipped. I am Father Guillaume, appointed by His Grace of Narbonne to oversee inquiries into matters of spiritual deviation. Anselm bowed his head. You have been absent from your station for nearly 5 weeks, Guillaume continued. You have issued no reports, and there are rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that you have associated with known deviants in Saint-Antonin. Do you deny this? Anselm looked up slowly. I do not deny it. The younger man blinked. And yet you returned. Why? To speak the truth. Guillaume leaned forward. Then speak it, clearly, without poetry. Anselm placed the Psalter upon the table. This was taken from a ruin near the village. It contained songs, not blasphemy. In that village, I found no altars to false gods, no rites of darkness, only light, shared, not stolen, remembered, not invented. That is not for you to decide. No, Anselm said gently, it is for Christ, and he was there, in their mercy, in their bread, in their silence. The silence that followed was long. Guillaume stared at him. You realize what you are saying places you in grave danger. I do. And still you defend them? I defend what I saw. Another silence. Then Guillaume rose. You will remain in the monastery under observation. The tribunal will convene in 3 days. Until then, you are to write your full account, without embellishment. Anselm bowed his head again. When the door closed behind the younger man, he exhaled, slow, steady. He was not afraid, not any longer, because in the quiet corners of a forgotten village, he had found something worth defending. And even if he burned for it, he would burn in truth. The cell they gave him was neither dark nor cruel. A narrow window let in pale light, filtered through the dust of 1,000 confessions whispered in this place. The walls bore no decoration, no scripture, only the faint scent of wax, ink, and the distant echo of prayers uttered in fear. A single desk stood against one wall, with parchment, quill, and ink waiting, as though the truth were simply a matter of putting it to paper. Brother Anselm sat there as the bells of Toulouse called sext across the damp air, and he placed his hands flat on the surface of the desk, as if to still their trembling. He had written many reports in his time, cold, precise, factual. Names, dates, offenses, prescribed penance, or more often, judgment. But this time, his hand hovered above the parchment for long minutes, the quill tip resting silently in the ink. When at last he wrote, it was not a report, it was a testimony. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, I write these words not to defend, but to illuminate. May they be read with the eyes of the soul, not only the lens of law. He wrote of Saint Antonin, of the weaver named Miriam, who shared bread before words, of the boy who mourned his sister by speaking to the stars, of the circle that gathered not in defiance, but in gentleness, to hold what others discarded. He wrote of silence, not as concealment, but as communion. He wrote of a girl in Carcassonne, and the flame that took her when no one else dared question. He wrote of his own fear, and of the slow, uncertain alchemy by which that fear was turned, day by day, word by word, into something resembling courage. I found no heresy in Saint Antonin, he wrote, but I found many saints. When he finished, night had fallen. His fingers ached. The ink had dried in streaks of brown and blue across his skin, and the parchment, 10 full pages, lay before him like a confession long delayed. He did not read it over. He folded the sheets, sealed them with wax, and left them on the desk as instructed. Then he lay on the narrow cot, arms folded across his chest, and stared at the ceiling where spider silk hung in the corners like forgotten scripture. Sleep came not as peace, but as surrender. The next morning, he was summoned to the inner court. The tribunal chamber was vast and spare, its stone walls lined with high, arching windows that let in a bruised gray light. 3 men sat upon the bench, 2 he did not know, and the third, Guillaume, his face composed in rigid neutrality. Anselm bowed, as was custom. The man seated at the center, older, sharp-eyed, spoke first. "Brother Anselm, we have read your account." Anselm said nothing. "There are notable omissions," the older man continued. "No names were offered, no formal charges made. You speak in tone more befitting a chronicler than a defender of the faith." "I offered what I saw," Anselm replied calmly. "You offered impressions, not indictments." A silence followed. Guillaume leaned forward. "You claim in your report that the people of Saint Antonin live the spirit of Christ more truly than many within our own walls. Do you stand by that statement?" "I do." The youngest of the judges, a narrow man with ink-stained fingers, furrowed his brow. "And yet they reject sacraments. They speak in a forbidden tongue. They follow no priest." Anselm's voice was quiet. "Christ himself spoke Aramaic, not Latin. He walked with fishermen, not scholars. He broke bread with sinners, not scribes." Another silence, this time heavier. Guillaume's lips pressed into a line. "You do not deny your failure to report the presence of known heretical practices?" "I do not deny it." "And you do not repent of this?" "I repent only my years of silence before now." The older judge raised a hand to still Guillaume's next words. "Brother Anselm," he said, "the Inquisition is not merely a sword. It is meant also to be a mirror. And while your words veer close to defiance, they are not without depth. However," he paused, weighing something invisible, "your authority as an inquisitor is hereby suspended. You are to remain within the bounds of this monastery for a period of 40 days, during which your actions and writings shall be examined further." A quiet echo rippled through the chamber. Not excommunication, not imprisonment, but exile, tethered silence. Guillaume looked displeased, but said nothing more. Anselm bowed once. "I accept." As he turned to leave, the older judge added, "Brother Anselm, why did you return? You could have disappeared." Anselm stopped at the door. "Because truth must be spoken aloud, even when it has no audience." The days that followed were long and still. He walked the cloister, read the Psalms, and tended the herb garden with the novices. He did not preach, he did not instruct, but he listened. To the birds nesting in the eaves, to the young monk who hummed old songs while sweeping the chapel, to the silence within himself where once only fire had burned. One morning he received a letter, not from Narbonne, not from Rome, but from St. Antonin, a folded page in a child's hand. "Brother Anselm, the stars are bright tonight. I told my sister I saw you in them. Mama says thank you for fixing the shutters. Come back when the figs ripen. We saved a basket for you." There was no seal, no fear, only light. And Anselm, for the first time in many years, wept not for sorrow, but for grace. The days of his confinement passed like slow-moving clouds. each one shapeless, quiet, and pale. The monastery at Toulouse stood like a sentinel above the winding Garonne, and Brother Anselm, no longer robed in authority, moved through its cloisters like a ghost whose presence no one questioned, yet few dared to meet with familiarity. He spent the mornings in the herb garden, pruning sage and lavender, his hands steady even as his mind wandered back to Saint-Antonin. There, spring would have fully blossomed by now. The almond trees would be bearing their first pale blossoms, and the children would be gathering violets by the stream. He imagined Miriam in her weaver's shed, the steady rhythm of loom and shuttle echoing like a heartbeat. He wondered if the circle still gathered, if the quiet still held, if in some small corner of their minds they remembered him, not as Inquisitor, but as man. On the 12th day, he was summoned again, not to the tribunal, but to the library, a tall arched chamber filled with the scent of vellum, beeswax, and the slow decay of forgotten pages. It was here that Brother Matthias, the monastery's chief scribe, worked, copying, translating, organizing the ecclesiastical memory of the church. Brother Anselm, Matthias greeted him with a nod. The tribunal has requested you assist with transcription during your reflection. Anselm inclined his head. I will do what I can. The work was steady and clean. Manuscripts of sermons, papal bulls, and letters of doctrine passed through his hands, but occasionally something else appeared, less formal, more ancient. One afternoon, Matthias handed him a crumbling folio with trembling reverence. A Provençal codex, poetry, found in a Cistercian cellar north of Albi. I believe you might understand the dialect? Anselm ran his fingers across the faded lines, and his breath caught. Occitan, not Church Latin, not Imperial French, but the old tongue, the tongue of troubadours, of hidden songs and whispered prayers. He nodded slowly. Yes, I understand it. Matthias looked relieved. Then perhaps you could begin copying it into Latin. He left Anselm to the task. But Anselm did not translate at once. He read, Lo jornces clar, l'alba trista, dins mon cor la dolor persista. The day is clear, the dawn is sorrowful, in my heart the pain persists. Line after line, the verses unfolded. Some were laments, others were fragments of mystical devotion, praising not the throne of Rome, but the flame of divine love hidden in the soul. He closed the codex. He did not write, not that day. That night, he sat alone by the cloister's fountain, the stars above swaying gently in the cold air. A novice passed and paused to greet him. You read the old language, the boy said softly, with that mixture of reverence and curiosity reserved for those who carried secrets. Anselm nodded. It's forbidden, isn't it? The boy asked. Some say so, Anselm replied, but others say it's only sleeping. The boy looked puzzled. Then slowly, a smile. I like that better. And he was gone. Anselm stared into the rippling water. How many tongues had the church silenced? How many songs lay buried beneath the weight of doctrine? And how many souls still carried those melodies in secret? On the 20th day, he received another letter. Not from Saint Antonin, not even signed. It was left upon his desk, scrawled in sharp, controlled Latin. Brother Anselm, there are those who have read your words and found them dangerous. Others, inspiring. You have stirred a quiet unease. Take care. Not all chains clang when they are tightened. He read it twice, then folded it carefully, placed it beneath the psalter, and said nothing. He knew the message's intent, a warning veiled as counsel, but it did not shake him. He had lived too long among the smoke of fear. Now he walked within the silence of truth. By the end of the 4th week, word reached the monastery. The new inquisitor sent to the southern villages had arrived in Saint-Antonin. No name was given, only that he was young, driven, and already gathering names. Anselm's hands trembled as he read the note posted by the gatekeeper. He said nothing to Matthias, nothing to the tribunal. That night, he returned to the scriptorium alone. He lit a single candle, opened a fresh scroll, and began to write. Not a report, not a defense, but a letter. To whoever walks the path I once walked. He wrote of Miriam, of the circle, of mercy. He wrote of power misused, of authority mistaken for grace. He begged, not as a superior, but as a brother, for the next inquisitor to listen, to wait, to see. And when he had finished, he did not sign it as Brother Anselm, only a servant of the light. He sealed the letter and gave it to a passing pilgrim, bound south. Deliver this to the weaver's house, he said, in Saint-Antonin. The pilgrim nodded, asked no questions. and as he walked away, Anselm felt a weight lift from his chest. A thread had been sent, a hope, however small, carried upon the wind. And within him, the ember stirred again, quiet but steadfast, not fire for burning, but for guiding. The 40th day came cloaked in a soft, golden mist. Morning sunlight filtered through the monastery windows in long, sacred shafts, illuminating motes of dust that danced as if to silent hymns. Brother Anselm, now gaunter than when he had first arrived, knelt in the chapel long before the bells rang lauds. He had not been summoned. No tribunal awaited him that day. Yet the silence had begun to speak in ways louder than any verdict. It was then, in that early hush, that Father Guillaume appeared beside him, not in robes of judgment, but in the plain habit of a man prepared for honest talk. "You've not spoken to anyone since the letter," Guillaume said, voice low and steady. "No," Anselm replied, eyes still closed. "I have spoken to myself enough." Guillaume sat beside him on the cold stone bench. "There are rumors now," he said. "Some say the Holy Office is displeased with your example, that you've softened the edge of our calling." Anselm opened his eyes and looked at him. "And do you believe that?" Guillaume hesitated. "I believe," he began, then faltered. "I believe you have made the rest of us uneasy." Anselm did not smile, but there was warmth in his voice. Then perhaps unease is the first breath of waking. The younger man fell into silence. His face, once stiff with youthful certainty, now carried the furrows of quiet reflection. "They've asked me," Guillaume finally said, "to take over your post, to go to Saint-Antonin." Anselm's breath caught. He looked into Guillaume's eyes. There he saw not hunger, not pride, but something else, a flicker of the same burden he had once carried into that village. "I've sent a letter ahead," Anselm said gently, "to the weaver's house, to prepare them." Guillaume nodded. "I thought you might have." He rose, robe brushing the floor, then paused. "I don't know what I'll do when I get there." Anselm stood slowly beside him. "Then do what I could not." "And what was that?" Anselm's gaze turned toward the altar. "Begin by listening, not searching." That evening, Anselm walked the outer gardens for the last time. The roses had begun to bloom, soft petals of white and pink clinging to thorn stems. Bees moved lazily through the air, and the wind held the fragrance of rosemary and lavender. He carried nothing with him but the Occitan Psalter and the last page of his own writings. Not a report, not a sermon, just one final entry. "The light does not always fall from heaven. Sometimes it rises from the earth, through the hands of those we call least, and the voices we silence. And when it does, it is not with thunder, but with the hush of mercy. I will follow it." He folded the page, placed it within the Psalter, and left it on the stone bench beneath the statue of St. Julian. Then he passed beyond the gates. No bells marked his departure. No guards asked his name. He became, once more, a traveler. Not of roads, but of spirit. The road south welcomed him like a familiar hymn. The dust beneath his feet, the wind curling through the hedges, the shimmer of poppies nodding in the distance, all of it spoke in the language he had come to understand without words. He passed pilgrims and traders, none of whom recognized him. He shared bread with a widow who spoke of her lost son, and with a shepherd who asked no questions but offered a place by his fire. And in each quiet encounter, Anselm felt himself less a figure of judgment and more a companion on the path of human frailty and grace. He was no longer an inquisitor. He was becoming something else, a witness, a keeper of lost lights. It was near dusk on the 5th day that the village of Saint-Antonin rose once more into view. It had changed, or perhaps it had not, but now he saw it with eyes no longer veiled by duty. Children laughed by the well. A girl chased chickens near the butcher's gate, and from a distant cottage, the smell of spiced lentils drifted on the breeze. He approached slowly, heart tight with hope and dread. At the edge of the square stood Miriam, a basket of linen on her hip, her shawl wrapped loosely about her shoulders. She saw him at once, and smiled. No words passed between them at first. Only that smile, gentle, knowing, and filled with a welcome deeper than any ritual. "You came back," she said at last. He nodded. "I was never truly gone." She stepped forward and took his hand. "They read your letter," she whispered, the circle, and they waited. He swallowed hard. "Is it still safe?" She looked at him then, not with fear, but with the fierce light of belief. "It is now." They walked together down the winding lane, past blooming lilacs and flickering lanterns toward the weaver's house. And as the first stars pierced the sky above them, Brother Anselm stepped into the cellar once more. But this time, he did not sit on the edge. He joined the circle, and the silence that greeted him was not empty. It was filled with the quiet breath of souls remembering how to be whole. That night, the air in the cellar was thick with the scent of beeswax, earth, and newly milled cloth. The walls seemed closer than he remembered, or perhaps he simply filled them more fully now, with presence, not burden. The flicker of candles cast long, delicate shadows along the floor, and each face in the circle turned toward him not with reverence, but with welcome. There was no applause, no murmured prayer, only a silence that enveloped him with quiet understanding. Miriam sat beside him, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulder, her hands, weathered from loom and garden, folded softly in her lap. Across the circle sat the baker's wife, the shepherd's niece, the boy who had once spoken to the stars. They had changed, some a little older, others wearing the marks of new sorrow or quiet joy, but their eyes had not lost the clarity that had first unsettled him. That quiet light, unclouded by fear or pride. Anselm bowed his head, and then, as if summoned not by custom but by instinct, they each reached for one another's hands. The circle closed, and the silence settled. For a time, no one spoke. Then the boy broke the hush with a simple whisper. "My sister visits in my dreams now," he said. "She doesn't speak, but she smiles." A murmur of acknowledgement passed through the room. Another voice followed. An old man, his eyes milky with age. "I have begun to forget the names of my children, but I remember the way they laughed." Miriam nodded gently. "We remember for you." A young woman, perhaps no more than 16, spoke next. "I was told by a cousin that I should flee, that the new Inquisitor would come, that he would burn everything down." All eyes turned to Anselm. He did not flinch. "I cannot promise he will not come," he said, "but I left a letter, and perhaps it will reach something deeper in him." "Will he be like you?" the girl asked, her voice small. "No," he said softly. "I pray he will be better." A silence again. Then Miriam spoke. "You came back, but you did not come as a priest, not even as a monk." "No," Anselm said. "I came as a man who has seen what fear does to the soul, and who longs above all for mercy." The circle held him in that moment, not with arms or words, but with presence, with the simple grace of being seen and not questioned. In the days that followed, Anselm stayed not as guest, but as kin. He helped the butcher's son repair a broken roof tile. He mended the chapel door with Father Gilles, who greeted him with no small astonishment, then a long, weary embrace. "You left a hole," the priest whispered. "I carried it with me," Anselm replied. He sat by the stream and taught children how to write their names in the earth with sticks. He translated old hymns into the forbidden tongue and sang them quietly while tending to the herb garden. Not once did he wear his old robe. It lay folded in his satchel, untouched, like a skin shed in a distant season. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky in deep purples and rose, Miriam found him seated beneath the yew trees where they had first spoken. She carried a small bundle wrapped in wool. "You forgot something," she said, placing it beside him. He opened it carefully. Inside was the Psalter in Occitan. He stared at it, hands trembling. "I left it behind," he said. "Yes," she replied, "because you knew you didn't need to carry it anymore, but it still belongs to you." He turned the pages. The worn vellum whispered beneath his fingertips. Each line held memory of loss, of awakening, of gentle rebellion. He closed it and looked at her. "Do you believe," he asked slowly, "that this circle, this life we've made, can last?" She met his gaze without blinking. "Only if we do not hide it." And he understood then that silence had once protected them, but now it could become a shroud. Their quiet had preserved their light. But one day they would need to speak, to be more than whispered mercy in forgotten corners, to be heard. That night, he returned to the circle. And when it was his turn to speak, he did not speak only of sorrow. He told them a story of a younger man in Carcassonne who had believed he was saving souls by extinguishing light. He told them how he had seen fire take more than flesh, and how one child's quiet faith had lit a path back to grace. He ended not with a blessing, but with a vow. "I am not your shepherd. I am not your judge. I am your witness, and your brother, and I will walk with you." The candles burned low. The circle held, and outside, beyond the cellar walls, spring poured its warmth into the earth, as if the very ground had decided to believe again in mercy. Spring ripened into early summer, and the hills surrounding Saint-Antonin turned a deep, jubilant green. The wheat swayed in soft waves beneath the wind, and the orchards hummed with bees, as if the very air had become a choir. Brother Anselm, no longer cloistered by robe or seal, moved through these days like a man reborn, though still carrying the fragile threads of his former self. He rose with the sun each morning, washing his hands in the cold stream, then walking the narrow paths through the village as dew sparkled like little blessings beneath his feet. He no longer kept the hours of the monastery, but instead followed the rhythm of the village, the sound of hooves on cobblestone, the laughter of children at midday, the hush of prayers whispered over bread and stew at dusk. Yet not all was still. News came on the wind, as it always did. The new Inquisitor had been seen in a nearby hamlet, 3 days east, in a place called Saint-Sergue. He was young, they said, cloaked in black, with a voice like iron and a gaze that found hidden things. He asked questions. He examined hands for ink stains. He demanded names. He traveled with scribes and firewood. When Miriam told Anselm this, her voice was quiet, but her eyes held the steady edge of someone who had outgrown fear. "What shall we do?" she asked, as they stood beneath the apricot tree in her garden. Anselm plucked one of the fruit, testing its weight. "You will live," he said, "as you always have. You will gather. You will sing. You will speak softly, but not in shame. And you?" He looked at her, the fruit still in his hand. "I will be ready." In the evenings, the circle met less frequently, but with greater purpose. They spoke not only of grief and healing, but of memory, and of how to protect what could not be written. Anselm began teaching the children in secret, not Latin, but a blend of scripture and story woven in the old tongue. He taught them to see holiness and kindness, not only in doctrine. One day, the boy who had lost his sister asked a question. "Will they hurt us?" The room grew quiet. Anselm knelt before him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "They might try," he said honestly, "but they cannot unmake what has already bloomed." "Like flowers?" the boy asked. "Yes," Anselm replied. "Like flowers that grow in stone." Word came again, 2 weeks later. The Inquisitor had reached the next valley. He had burned 2 books, detained a widow, questioned a midwife. Anselm stood by the well that evening, staring into the water as the golden light of sunset turned the surface into a pool of fire. He heard footsteps behind him. Father Gilles approached, robes gathered about him. "They say he'll be here before the feast of St. John," the priest said. Anselm nodded. "He is searching for heresy." "No," Anselm said. "He is searching for certainty." The priest sighed. "And what will he find?" "That depends," Anselm replied, "on whether he comes with a sword or with ears." Gilles looked down into the well. "Do you remember what you once said to me?" he asked. "When you first arrived." "I said many things," Anselm replied. "You told me I preached like a man who had never wept." A smile touched Anselm's face. "And now?" "You preach like a man who has learned to listen." They stood there for a while, the sky above them deepening to violet. On the night of the summer solstice, the circle met again beneath the open sky, for the cellar had grown too warm and too small. They gathered in the grove beyond the fields, where the yews had long whispered secrets to the wind. Lanterns hung from branches. Children sat on blankets, eating figs and bread. Old songs, banned by decree but carried in memory, were hummed quietly as the stars began to prick through the dark. Anselm stood at the edge, watching. Miriam came to his side. "You seem far away," she said. "I am remembering," he replied. "When I first came here, I thought silence was something to enforce. Now I see it was always a sanctuary." She looked at him, her brow lined with thought. "Will you speak tonight?" He shook his head. "No, tonight I will listen." And so he did. He listened to the stories shared around the fire. The tale of a lost love, of a mother who forgave a thief, of a boy who dreamed of angels guarding the door. He listened to laughter that rose like incense, pure and free. He listened to the wind threading through the grass and to the hush that followed the last song. And when the fire burned low and the circle slowly dispersed, he remained in the grove, alone, looking at the stars, and he prayed, not with words, but with the full weight of his presence. A prayer of hope, a prayer for the Inquisitor who would come, and for the light that would meet him, not with argument, but with quiet truth. Beneath the cloistered hush of dawn, when the cobbled streets of Alzena lay shrouded in pale fog, and the spires of its abbey rose like phantoms against the sleepy sky, Brother Teo emerged from the dormitory's shadowed threshold. His robe, once the soft beige of Franciscan humility, now bore the wear of 10 winters, tattered at the hems, the corded rope about his waist nearly unraveling. And yet it was not the robe, nor the quiet creak of his sandaled step that marked his presence. It was the weight in his eyes. Eyes that had looked upon heresy in a dozen forms and seen 100 confessions wrung from trembling lips. The 11th year of his service had brought him to this town, nestled in the lesser-seen marches of the crown's frontier, a place forgotten by kings but watched closely by bishops. Here, the Inquisition had taken root not in the iron and flame known to fable, but in parchment and silence, in the painstaking audit of souls. And here, as the fog lifted, Brother Teo prepared to begin another of those quiet reckonings. A knock on the wooden chamber door stirred Brother Marseille, the younger scribe assigned to Theo's detail. Marseille, barely into his 3rd year of vows, still wore the eager timbre of belief in his voice. His hand quivered as he set ink to scroll, though whether from cold or conscience, Theo could not tell. They found something, Marseille said, eyes flickering toward the window, where a figure in a hooded tabard waited at the outer gate. Theo nodded and moved slowly, always slowly. He had learned that haste belonged to the fearful. The confident inquisitor, the deadly inquisitor, did not rush. He greeted the messenger with a bowed head and took the folded paper sealed with the bishop's crest, 3 black thorns beneath a crimson flame. A weaver's wife? Theo murmured as he read. Named Elaine, attends no feast day, keeps strange herbs, speaks to birds. The accusations, as always, were a whisper away from absurdity. But in these hinterlands, suspicion wove tighter than thread. Theo handed the parchment to Marseille and gestured they prepare the chamber. There would be questioning by twilight. The questioning chamber beneath the chapel had no iron maiden, no rack, no rope stained dark. It had a desk and 2 stools. A brazier for warmth. A crucifix carved in quiet oak. This was Theo's way. He did not believe in blood. Blood brought confession, yes, but it also brought lies. The truth, the real truth, lay somewhere between terror and trust required stillness. When Elaine arrived, escorted by 2 of the bishop's guards, she looked neither broken nor defiant. She was lean, weathered, her hands like bark, and her eyes bright as spring frost. She did not weep. She did not speak. She merely sat when gestured to, and folded her hands. Theo studied her a long time before speaking. Do you know why you are here, child of God? Elaine tilted her head. Because I talk to birds? Even Marseille looked startled by her candor. Theo merely nodded. And do they talk back? In a way, if you listen. Silence hung like an old tapestry in the room. Theo leaned forward, elbows on knees. Do you gather herbs? Yes. My mother was an herbalist. And the feast days? I work. I do not mean offense, but God does not seem to mind. He sends me no warnings. Theo exhaled through his nose. There was no fire here, no pride, no denial, only a woman who had lived apart and frightened others by doing so. He dismissed Elaine with emotion, and she was led away. Not yet accused, not yet marked, merely noted. But that night, as Marseille laid out the reports and copied the details into the registry, Theo stared at the single candle between them and spoke low. Do you believe her? Marseille hesitated. She seems honest or tired of pretending. That, Theo said, is often the same thing. He left the chamber and walked the perimeter of the chapel, the cold cutting through his robe. Something gnawed at him. Not Elaine's case, not truly, but the shape of the town itself. Alzena was shifting. The people had grown quieter. Their eyes lingered longer. The church pews were still full, but the voices were hushed, wary, as if they awaited a storm no one had named. The next morning, Brother Theo visited the market. Not to buy, but to watch. The weaver, Elaine's husband, was at his loom, but his hands trembled as he worked. Children whispered and pointed when Theo passed. It was not fear in their eyes, but a strange reverence, the kind given to relics or bones of saints, things sacred and distant and dangerous. He paused at the herb stand. A young woman, no more than 20, sold dried bundles of thyme and yarrow. She glanced at him and bowed her head. You're the one who listens, she said. Theo raised an eyebrow. They say you don't burn people, that you ask first. He did not reply, only touched 2 fingers to the edge of the crucifix at his breast. That afternoon, a second letter came, another name, a blacksmith's apprentice, accused of carving symbols into the stable doors. Theo closed his eyes. The pattern was forming, a web of fear. Not heresy, no, not yet, but the seed of panic, watered by superstition. As he returned to the chapel, Marseille stopped him. The bishop's envoy arrives tomorrow. Theo paused. So soon? Marseille nodded. He rides with a clerk and 2 knights. It meant only one thing. The bishop wanted a trial, a visible one, something to restore order. That night, Theo stood by the brazier and watched the flames shift through orange and gold. He thought of Elaine, of the birds in the trees, of how her eyes had not flinched once. He thought of the apprentice boy, too, and the next name that would surely come. And for the first time in many years, the Inquisitor prayed not for guidance, but for delay. A single day longer before the fire was lit. A single chance for truth to emerge from shadow. But he knew, as all Inquisitors do, that the wheel of the Church turns not with mercy, but with momentum. And once in motion, it does not stop. The next day dawned sullen and colorless. The sky above Alzana stretched taut with gray cloud and the promise of distant rain. The bells of the abbey rang not for mass, but in quiet heraldry, for the arrival of the bishop's envoy. By midday, a hush fell across the town square as hooves struck the cobblestones with unhurried finality. The people peered from behind shutters and awnings, and children sat upon stone steps, hushed by the weight of spectacle. 3 riders came in modest procession, one cloaked in the sable and crimson of episcopal authority, another clad in the fine charcoal robe of a court scribe, and the last 2 armored knights whose lances remained upright but ever near at hand. They dismounted before the chapel and did not look back. Brother Theo waited at the threshold, his face carved of shadow and patience. He bowed deeply as the envoy approached. The man was lean, of middle years, with eyes sharp as glass beneath a high forehead and tonsured hair. He did not smile. "Father Theo," he said, his voice clipped, "I am Dominic de Fraise. His Grace sends word of grave concern." Theo gestured them inward, where Marseille had prepared the long chamber with scrolls arranged and quills sharpened. The envoy's gaze swept the room, not with curiosity but calculation. De Fraise seated himself and gestured for his scribe to begin taking record. "There is unrest, you understand. The bishop hears of strange rites, of disobedience cloaked in custom, of witchcraft hiding in plain day. You are trusted, brother, but trust does not excuse delay." Theo's voice was low, steady. "There has been no trial, because there has been no confession. No evidence that holds weight beyond whispers and the convenient fear of those who live in shadows." Dominic's brows rose. "Confession is not always the beginning. It is sometimes the end. An end that brings clarity." Marseille said nothing. His quill moved slowly across the page. The rest of the day passed in scrutiny. Dominic walked the streets, questioned merchants and widows, leaned close to murmuring children. He stopped to peer at the stable doors marked by the blacksmith's apprentice, though the symbols had already faded beneath the scrub of soap and ash. He visited the weaver's hut, stood beneath the eaves where sparrows chirped and flew from the rafters, and spoke little. At sundown, he returned to the chapel. "She must stand trial," he said, eyes glinting. "The woman Elaine, she is the axis upon which the town's heresies pivot." Theo exhaled slowly, his hands folded before him. "She has not denied her gathering of herbs. She has not cursed nor healed nor spoken blasphemy. She does not speak against the church. But she lives without it," Dominic said. "And that, in time, becomes a louder sermon than any preacher can offer. Bring her forth." The trial was set for the following dusk, beneath the vaulted ribs of the chapel's sanctuary. No fires were to be lit, at least not yet. The trial was to be observed, recorded, and judged. And though no one said it aloud, all understood. It was also to be watched. When Elaine was brought forth, she wore the same homespun shift as before, her hair bound in a simple braid. She neither looked afraid nor defiant. She sat upon the bench with the quiet dignity of someone long practiced in solitude. Dominic presided from the chair beneath the crucifix. Theo stood to one side, not seated, not silent, but present, like a sentinel who watches the gates, not to keep people out, but to see who enters. Marseille read the charges, withholding observance of feast days, consorting with animals in a manner deemed unnatural, tending herbs without ecclesiastical sanction, and suspicion of guiding others from the path of doctrine through example rather than speech. Elaine listened and nodded. When asked if she understood the charges, she said yes. When asked if she denied them, she said no. But when asked why she lived so, she spoke softly, eyes upon the crucifix above. There is a stillness in the woods, she said, where things grow in order, where death feeds life, and nothing is wasted. I do not scorn the church. I simply hear another rhythm. It does not speak in sermons, but in wind and root and stone. Is that heresy? Dominic's lips pressed thin. It is heresy when it displaces the truth. And if truth is larger than one place? She asked. There was silence in the chamber then, so complete that even the birds in the high eaves of the chapel seemed to hush. Theo did not move. Dominic looked to the scribe. Record her words and prepare the chamber for sentencing. But that evening, as the sky wept soft rain and the town returned to its hushed rhythms, Theo sat alone in the scriptorium with Elaine's words echoing through him like liturgy. He stared at the empty ledger, his hand hovering above the parchment. She does not lie, he murmured. Nor does she preach. She simply is. Marseille, who lingered by the doorway, said nothing, but his eyes held the same thought. Later that night, Theo went into the sanctuary alone, carrying only a candle and the scrolls of testimony. He placed them at the altar, beside the old chalice and the worn gospel, and knelt there. Lord, he whispered, if this is your work, let me see the sin in her soul. Let me feel the stain in her presence. But if there is none, let me bear the weight of saying so, even if the fire comes for me too. The flame of the candle flickered once, then stilled. The day that followed was cloaked in a silence not unlike mourning, though no one had died, not yet. The town moved in softened rhythms, voices subdued, footsteps slower, as though all waited for a sentence they did not wish to hear but dared not ignore. In the chapel, preparations were underway for what would not yet be named, but already felt like the edge of execution. Dominic Defraz stood at the heart of the sanctuary, issuing orders in precise, emotionless tones. A das here. Candles on either side. Let the light bear witness. The accused shall kneel. We shall read the verdict before sunset. Theo watched with the still gaze of one who had seen too many such ceremonies, too many names burned into parchment, too many lives rendered into cautionary tales. When he finally spoke, it was not to protest, but to suggest. Allow her to speak once more. Not for the record, for the people. Dominic raised a brow. Why? Her words are poison, even when gentle. Theo folded his hands. Because if we are to condemn her, they must know her voice, not the echo of it on parchment. After a pause, the envoy nodded. Very well, but be brief. That afternoon, as the townsfolk gathered within the nave, the light slanted through the stained glass in fractured bands, amber and rose and deep indigo falling across stone and wood like the robes of angels turned away. Elaine was brought forth not in chains, but with 2 guards flanking her loosely, as though she were some patient guest rather than a heretic awaiting judgment. She did not bow. She did not plead. She simply looked at them. Theo stepped forward, his voice low and steady. You have been heard in accusation, Elaine. Speak now, if you would, not to defend, but to be remembered rightly. She stepped onto the modest platform, her bare feet quiet upon the worn boards. She looked not at Dominic, nor at Theo, but at the people of Alzina, at the weaver who once hired her husband, the baker who bought her wild mint, the children she had once shown how to watch the stars. I was not made for stone, she began softly. I was made for wind. I do not know the scriptures as you do, but I have known stillness. I have tended the sick not with miracles, but with time. I have spoken to birds, not because they answered, but because it made the world less empty. Her hands, weathered and strong, remained at her sides. She did not weep. I did not teach rebellion. I did not gather followers. I did not cast spells or summon storms or twist the minds of men. I walked a different path. That is all. For a long moment, the air held its breath. No murmurs rose, only the shifting of benches, the creak of wood. Then Dominic stood. And yet it is in such silence that defiance festers. The church is not one voice. It is the many raised as one. Yours has wandered, and for that, we must guide it or silence it. The sentence was to be read at dusk. Theo stood beside Marseille in the scriptorium as the young scribe reviewed the final script. She will be cast from the church, Marseille said quietly, and made to wear the mark. Not the pyre, Theo murmured. No, Marseille confirmed, but exile, branded. Theo closed his eyes. The mark, a brand upon the shoulder in the shape of the bishop's flame, to signify a soul lost to sanctioned doctrine, a sentence not of death, but of erasure. She would not be imprisoned nor hanged, but cast into the wilderness where none would offer aid without risk of sharing her fate. She may live, Marseille offered, as though that were mercy. But Theo knew better. The loneliness would be the blade. That night the town gathered again, this time not to listen, but to bear witness. Dominic read the verdict in crisp Latin, then again in the tongue of the commoners. Hélène knelt without protest. The iron, glowing faintly from the brazier, was brought forth. Theo turned away before the hiss of metal met flesh. He could not bear it. Not again. Hélène did not cry out, but the silence afterward seemed to ring. By the time she was led from the chapel, her shoulder bandaged and her path sealed, the stars had risen. Not many followed her departure. The guards escorted her to the town's edge and left her by the gate with no food, no cloak, only her clothes and the mark she would carry forever. She did not look back. Inside the chapel, Theo stood before the altar, his fingers resting lightly upon the edge of the gospel. Dominic approached, his tone clipped as ever. Justice is served. Justice, Theo repeated, or precedent. Dominic paused. They are often the same. Theo looked at him then, not with anger, but with the cold sorrow of truth unchangeable. Then perhaps we are building our truths on ash. That night, he did not return to the dormitory. Instead, he walked the empty fields beyond the chapel, where Hélène's path had faded into the darkness. He did not expect to see her, and he did not call out, but he carried a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and a flask of water. He left them beneath the old tree where the path split into three, where wild mint grew in the soil, where the birds often sang. Then he turned back and did not speak for the rest of the night. It was 3 days before her name was spoken again. Alzina, though small and quiet, could not help but ripple in the wake of such judgment. The exile of Hélène did not fade as quickly as the envoy expected. The villagers did not sing hymns louder, nor did they gather more devoutly. Instead, they moved as though something delicate had been broken, an unseen thread that once stitched their silence together. The birds still sang from the rafters, but the weaver no longer smiled. The baker's hands moved slower, and the children, once curious, kept to the shadow of their mother's skirts. Theo saw it all from the stone cloister that overlooked the courtyard garden. He sat often beneath the old apple tree there, its leaves green and trembling in the wind, its blossoms still untouched by the season's first bees. He did not speak of Hélène, but he thought of her constantly, of the calmness with which she had spoken, the absence of hate in her farewell. Dominic remained in Alzina, at least for the time being. He spoke often of order, of the necessity of vigilance. He wrote letters daily, sealing them with wax and sending them via the bishop's riders. Though no pyre had been built, he carried himself as if flames had cleansed the town. He spoke of victory. But Theo knew better. He had seen the way the townsfolk glanced at one another, hesitant, unsure, not afraid of Hélène, but afraid of what they themselves might become if watched too closely. Afraid of the new silence that had settled between them, where words were once easy. One morning, as mist clung to the edges of the fields, Marseille entered the scriptorium with hesitation in his step. He carried a folded scrap of linen, and in its center lay a small bird, still and cold. "It flew into the chapel window," he said quietly. "Broke its neck." Theo looked down at the bird, a sparrow, its feathers fluffed from the chill, one wing slightly twisted. He picked it up gently and held it in his palm. "I'll bury it," he said, and rose. In the garden behind the chapel, where lavender and sage had once grown wild before the Inquisition had ordered them pruned, Theo dug a small hole near the base of the tree. He laid the sparrow in the earth with care, then smoothed the soil over with quiet reverence. "She would have wept for it," he said aloud. Marseille stood nearby, his brow furrowed. "Why do you say that?" "Because she saw things as connected. Even this bird. Even us." Marseille didn't reply, but something in his expression shifted, an unease that had been brewing behind his eyes since the trial. Later that week, Dominic summoned Theo to the inner chamber. Scrolls lay before him, each bearing new names. Suspicions gathered from other nearby parishes. One village had reported a man who wandered the woods alone at night. Another had concerns over a midwife who refused to baptize a stillborn child. They come faster now, Dominic noted. The people are learning to see. No, Theo replied quietly. They are learning to fear. Dominic gave a thin smile, and fear is often the beginning of wisdom. The next name on the list caught Theo's eye. It was a boy, no more than 10, who had been found drawing strange symbols in the dirt behind the chapel. A servant's son, barefoot, curious. No one claimed to have seen him speak a single word against the church. Only the drawings. They say he watched the trial, Marseille later told him. He saw Elaine kneel. He saw the brand. Theo's heart ached. He does not understand what he saw. Maybe not, Marseille said, but perhaps he understands what was lost. As dusk fell, Theo returned to the sanctuary. The space, once sacred and serene, now felt different. Not profaned, but hollowed. The absence of something unseen echoed through its stones. He knelt at the front pew where Elaine had once stood. He closed his eyes and whispered into the stillness. I am not a man of rebellion. I wear no sword. I serve the church with prayer and pen. But if mercy is heresy, then let me fall with the fallen. The candlelight flickered on the altar, and for a moment, Theo thought he heard the rustle of wings, soft and distant, a sound that lived between memory and dream. He turned, but no one stood there. Only Marseille, seated in the back, pen idle in hand, watching him not with suspicion, but with something like understanding. That night, as the wind carried a hush through the cloisters, Theo dreamed of Hélène. Not burning, not broken, but walking through a grove of tall trees, her hands brushing the leaves, birds circling above her in slow, graceful arcs. She looked back at him once and smiled. When he woke, the chapel bells rang for morning prayer. But Theo did not rise. He stayed beneath his blanket of silence and began to wonder, not what came next, but how long one could live while wearing the robes of faith, when one's soul no longer heard the rhythm of its song. The spring deepened with a quiet insistence, as though the earth, in defiance of human weight and worry, insisted on its gentle work. Pale blossoms unfurled along the winding hedgerows, and the fields beyond Alzena stirred with new life, soft grasses that bowed beneath morning dew, and the timid emergence of lambs on unsteady legs. Yet within the chapel walls, nothing softened. There, spring was but a word in the liturgical calendar, its beauty muted by the slow, grinding turn of ecclesiastical machinery. More names came, more whispered suspicions, more pages inscribed with fear, folded and sealed with wax bearing the bishop's thorned flame. The townspeople, once merely cautious, had grown reticent, not silent in the way that peace makes silent, but in the way that tension steals language. Where once greetings had passed with smiles or nods, now there was only the lowering of eyes, the briefest exchange of breath. The chapel remained full during Mass, but it was a fullness that did not rejoice, it endured. Dominic de Fraisse, for his part, remained fixed like a monument at the center of this spreading stillness. His presence had become a kind of weather, predictable, precise, yet chilling all the same. Each morning he took his place at the center desk in the scriptorium, reviewing accusations and making notations in his crisp, angular script. He dispatched riders to neighboring parishes. He walked the cloisters as if measuring the ground for rot. One overcast morning, Dominic addressed Brother Theo directly, his eyes glinting beneath the folds of his dark hood. The village is compliant, he said, but not obedient. That difference lingers, and where it lingers, heresy breathes. Theo regarded him for a long moment before replying. Obedience drawn from fear is not the same as obedience born of trust, and fear, though useful, does not last. Dominic's lip curled faintly. It needn't last, only be strong enough to reshape the soul. Clay does not remain soft forever. The impression must be made before it dries. That day, as if summoned by fate or providence, Marseille entered the chamber with something small clutched in his hands. He looked pale, his brow damp despite the chill of the stone corridors. This came to me, he whispered, placing the object on the table between them. It was a folded scrap of parchment, wrapped in a piece of homespun cloth. The scent of thyme still clung to it. Theo unfolded it carefully, his breath catching as he recognized the careful flowing hand. I am not far. I follow the river where it runs quiet. The birds keep watch and the trees remember. Tell the boy not to fear the symbols. They are not curses. They are songs, written in the language of leaves and time. I am well. I do not hate you. I hope the wind still speaks in your dreams. Elaine, still near. Still speaking, Dominic's hand hovered above the parchment, but he did not touch it. She lingers, he said, defiant. This must be answered. If we allow such a voice to echo, even from the woods, we undo our work. She offers no rebellion, Theo said quietly, only memory and mercy. Dominic's voice sharpened. She defies by her existence, by her refusal to vanish. That is the nature of rot. It does not shout. It spreads in silence. He left the room soon after, calling for 2 of the knights who had remained since the trial. Prepare to ride, he said. We will search the river paths. She cannot be allowed to remain. Theo and Marseille stood in the wake of his absence, the parchment still open upon the table. The young scribe looked down at it as though it were something holy. She's not hiding, Marseille whispered. She's waiting. For what? Theo asked. Marseille looked up, eyes heavy. For us. That evening, Theo took to the outer fields alone. The stars blinked to life above the woods, and the wind moved through the tall grasses like a sleeping breath. He walked until he found the crooked elm tree that stood near the path Elaine had once followed when she tended wild herbs. Beneath its twisted boughs, he paused. There, etched faintly into the dry earth, were symbols, circles and lines, arranged not as warnings, but as invitations. A spiral that curved inward like the curl of a fern, a dot within a triangle. A sign he remembered from the corner of a faded herb book, meaning return or healing. He knelt and brushed the soil smooth, erasing the signs before morning light could reveal them to another. The next day passed in quiet dread. Dominic's knights scoured the riverbanks, stopping farmers in the fields, questioning shepherds. A new edict was posted upon the church doors. Any who were caught aiding or sheltering the exiled woman would face trial. Heretics breed in shadow. It read, "Let there be no shadow in your hearts." The townspeople read the words, but none spoke. Inside the chapel, Theo moved through his duties with the weight of lead in his limbs. The liturgy sounded hollow. The incense burned without scent. Even prayer, once a balm, became a kind of labor. At night, he returned again to the elm tree. This time he found a different gift. 2 sprigs of lavender, bound with a strand of reddish hair, laid atop a smooth stone. Beneath it, a note in that same familiar hand. "You remembered the bread. Thank you." He folded it and placed it beneath his robe, over his heart. When he returned to the chapel, Marseille was waiting by the door. He said nothing, only nodded toward the sanctuary where Dominic paced beneath the high windows. "She was seen," Marseille murmured. "Near the stream. A child glimpsed her between the trees." Theo looked toward the window. The stars were rising again. "We are running out of time," he said. "But for what?" Marseille asked. "To capture her or to remember who we were before we forgot how to listen?" Theo did not answer. But that night, he began to pack a satchel, not to flee, but to follow. The dawn that followed was shrouded in pale mist, soft and damp as a veil laid over the land. The bells had not yet rung, and the town of Alzena lay in a hush so complete that even the crows refrained from calling. The stillness, however, did not reach the scriptorium, where Brother Theo moved with quiet purpose, gathering the few things he would carry with him. A small satchel of coarse linen, a loaf of dark bread wrapped in wax cloth, a flask of water, and a copy of the Psalter, its pages worn at the corners and bearing faint notes in his own hand. He did not take his cross, nor the heavy outer cloak of his station, only the soft robe of an ordinary friar, as if he meant not to leave on a mission, but to disappear into the countryside like a pilgrim seeking silence. Marseille stood in the doorway, watching with uncertain eyes. He had not spoken since midnight, when Theo had placed Elaine's latest note before him on the table and said nothing at all. Some things, he had come to realize, were too sacred for speech. "Will you return?" the scribe asked at last. Theo paused. In some way. Marseille nodded, though he did not understand. "They already do," Theo said gently, and fastened the satchel over his shoulder. He left through the garden gate, avoiding the cloisters where Dominic's men still lingered. The path he chose was not the main road, but the lesser-used trail that wound behind the old mill, where thistle and bramble grew high and the stream whispered softly over stones smoothed by generations of forgotten feet. He walked without haste, each step measured, not as a man fleeing danger, but as one approaching something long awaited. The forest greeted him with open stillness, the trees arching overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a second, older church. The air beneath their branches was cooler, and the sun, not yet fully risen, filtered through the canopy in slender shafts, dusted with pollen and memory. Birds chirped in the distance, and somewhere deeper in the woods, the soft rustle of a deer marked the rhythm of his pace. He walked for hours, guided not by map or sign, but by something gentler, an intuition born of familiarity, like the memory of a path once known in childhood and only half forgotten. Symbols etched faintly into bark guided him at times. A spiral here, a single dot beneath a crooked branch there. Elaine's quiet signposts, meant not for the church's hunters, but for those who still walked with their ears open to the world's quieter voices. By noon, the stream had widened, its waters clear and gliding over stones green with moss. He knelt to drink, and when he looked up, he saw her. Elaine stood across the water, barely a dozen paces away, wrapped in a simple cloak the color of rain-washed stone. Her hair had grown longer, tangled by the wind, and a faint scar still marked her shoulder where the iron had touched her. But her eyes, those quiet, deep eyes, were unchanged. They regarded each other in silence. No accusation, no apology, only recognition. "You found the path," she said at last. "I followed your words," Theo replied. She nodded, and her smile, faint, weary, but true, lifted something inside him that had lain heavy for too long. "There's a place," she said, "not far, where the trees grow in a circle. It's safe for now." He crossed the stream barefoot, water biting at his ankles, and followed her through the underbrush until they came to a clearing ringed by ancient oaks. Moss covered the ground like a carpet, and in the center, stones had been arranged, not haphazardly, but with care, as though in quiet prayer. Here, she had made her home, not in shelter, but in rhythm. A bed of woven branches beneath a canopy of leaves, a kettle blackened by flame, bundles of herbs drying in the crook of a tree, signs of life, not survival. They sat together beneath the tallest tree, and Theo unwrapped the bread, breaking it in half. "You are still a monk," she said softly. "I am still something," he replied. For a time, they ate in silence. The stream gurgled beyond the trees, and the wind moved gently through the branches, carrying with it the scent of pine and wild thyme. When they had finished, Elaine turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Why did you come?" Theo was slow to answer. "Because I could no longer say that I served truth when I was silent in the face of cruelty. Because I watched a town turn against itself. Because I heard your voice in prayer more clearly than I've heard the Mass in years." She looked at him then, and something in her gaze was not triumph, but sorrow. "They will come for you now," she said. "I know. And you will not run?" "No." She did not question it further. Instead, she reached into a pouch at her side and drew forth a small object wrapped in cloth. She handed it to him with both hands, and he opened it carefully. Inside was a sprig of dried rue, tied with thread, and a tiny wooden carving, a bird, wings folded, its eyes closed as if in sleep. "It's not protection," she said. "Not truly, but it remembers the shape of it." Theo closed the cloth and held it to his chest. "That is enough." As the afternoon waned into the golden hush of evening, they spoke little, sharing only the silence of those who no longer needed to ask the reasons behind their choices. The clearing, bathed in honeyed light, seemed to breathe with them, a place held not by walls, but by will. When night fell, they lit no fire. The stars watched in their place. The stars glimmered in their quiet dominion above the clearing, casting their pale, silver light across the moss-covered earth. It was a night without fire. By necessity, yes, but also by quiet reverence. Fire would have felt intrusive here, a shout in a room meant for whispers. The forest, ancient and knowing, embraced them in hush and shadow. The air smelled of pine resin and damp stone, of soil warmed by day and cooled again by dusk. Beneath the outstretched limbs of the great oak, Brother Theo and Elaine sat close together, backs resting against the knotted bark, their legs stretched over the soft moss. Neither spoke. They had long since moved beyond the need for idle words. Their silence was not strained or uncertain. It was full. The kind of silence that carries within it the weight of shared experience, of decisions that cannot be unmade, and of truths understood too deeply to be spoken aloud. Theo held the small wooden bird in his hands. Its wings were folded, its eyes carved closed, the edges worn smooth from handling. It was not a charm, not a relic. It was something gentler, a memory in shape and wood meant to be held in the dark. Elaine broke the silence first, her voice barely above the rustle of leaves. "Do you miss it?" He turned his head slightly, not needing to ask what she meant. "The chapel?" he replied. She nodded, gazing upward at the stars that freckled the darkness. Theo exhaled slowly, the breath lingering in the cool air. "I miss what I thought it was. The quiet, the order, the promise that within those stone walls I was part of something sacred. I miss believing that to speak the name of God was enough to sanctify a space. And now?" "Now," he said after a pause, "I wonder if I have mistaken silence for sanctity, if I have mistaken stone for sanctuary." She said nothing for a moment, and then softly, "It does not have to remain so." Theo tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "The sacred," she murmured, "was never made of stone. It was never held in incense or robes or Latin. It lives in the spaces between people, in kindness offered freely, in hands that mend instead of break." He looked at her, truly looked, at the curve of her cheekbone, the faint scar beneath her collar where the iron had touched her, the way her hair had grown wild and free, no longer braided by duty but tousled by the wind. "You still believe in it," he said. "I do," she replied, "though I no longer believe it can be contained." He smiled, a weary, honest smile. "You're wiser than me." "No," she said gently, "only wounded differently." A branch snapped somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing, sharp and sudden. Both of them stiffened, their bodies tensing instinctively. They waited, ears tuned to the forest, but no voice followed, no hoofbeat, no second crack, only the slow, rhythmic breathing of the woods. "They're closer," Theo said, his voice low. Elaine nodded. "The birds are quieter tonight. They listen better than we do." They slept lightly, wrapped in cloaks beneath the overhang of root and stone. The ground beneath them was not comfortable, but it was honest. It did not pretend to be anything it was not. Theo dreamed of the Abbey, of its high windows, its echoing halls. But in his dream, the chapel was empty and the pews wept sap instead of wax. At first light, the sky was a slate gray, heavy with the threat of distant rain. They broke their fast with small pieces of the bread he had brought and a handful of berries Elaine had foraged the day before. They did not speak of their plan. There was none, only the knowledge that they must keep moving. She led him through the thinner paths of the wood, trails known only to deer and those who watched the world rather than tried to master it. Here, the forest floor was dappled with spring violets and the delicate white stars of wild garlic blossoms. The stream curved away behind them, winding toward the places Dominic's men were more likely to search. By midday, they reached a hollow beneath a high ridge where the trees grew tall and tightly packed. There, in the cool, dim light beneath their branches, a natural shelter had formed, a stone outcropping, mossy and dry beneath its curve, a place to rest if only for a few hours. They sat together, leaning once more against the stone. The silence had returned, but it was different now, charged. They both felt it. Elaine looked at him. "What will you do if they find us?" "I don't know," he said. "I think I will not fight, but I will not lie. And if they offer you return, I will refuse." She studied him a moment longer. "Then we are the same." He reached into his satchel and drew out the psalter. She smiled, recognizing the worn leather cover. "You still carry it." He nodded. "Some words are still true, even if the voices behind them are not." She reached for the book, and he handed it to her without hesitation. She turned the pages gently, then stopped at one where he had made a faint mark, a passage he had read many times beneath candlelight. "Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other." She traced the words with her finger. "It's not about judgment." "No," he said, "it never was." That evening, as dusk fell again, they built no fire, but Theo noticed it first, the way the birds had fallen completely silent. No song, no warning, no farewell. He looked at Elaine. "They're close," she nodded, and neither of them ran. Beneath the cloistered shadows of the crumbling abbey at Saint Martial, dusk settled with a hush upon the cobbled lanes, soaking the air in a soft violet hue. The bells had long ceased their ringing, and only the hush of the wind through the crypt's ancient crevices gave song to the twilight. There, hidden deep within the worn pages of the Inquisition's dusty ledgers, a name returned again: Father Miquel de Ventador. His legacy, shrouded in both dread and devotion, stirred once more in whispers passed between aging friars and the ever-curious scribes. Father Miquel, once a noble-born second son destined for the sword, had instead taken up the robe in penance for youthful bloodshed. Now in his 60th year, his limbs stiffened with time and scar-touched weather, he had grown pale and thin like a candle in its final hours. His voice, though quiet, still bore the gravity of judgment, and his eyes, pale gray and unblinking, saw sin where others saw silence. The events of that year, in the waning days of winter, would test even Miquel's withered soul. A pale courier, gaunt and wide-eyed, arrived at dawn with a letter marked with the crimson wax of the Archdiocese of Bourges. Its language was deliberate, bearing tidings of heretical gatherings in the marshlands near Bellac, rumors of a forgotten sect calling themselves the Children of the Vine. Their teachings whispered of divine communion through wine and sensual ecstasy, merging the sacred and profane in blasphemous union. The letter commanded an immediate journey. Though Miquel's body ached at the mere thought of travel, he did not hesitate. He summoned Brother Arnaud, his silent apprentice of many winters, and together they prepared the mule-drawn cart with sacred relics, flasks of holy water, and the heavy scrolls of doctrine. As the abbey's gates groaned open beneath the frosted sky, the journey began with no fanfare, only the somber watch of those too old or too afraid to follow. The road to Bellac, lined with bare trees and cloaked in lingering snow, passed through forgotten hamlets and fields now reclaimed by thistle. As they traveled, Father Miquel's mind wandered to earlier days, when the Inquisition held the trembling attention of lords and peasants alike. Now, fewer dared invoke its authority, and many towns met them with veiled hostility. Heresy had grown subtle, wearing the masks of mysticism, of medicine, even of love. On the third day, they reached the edge of the marshes. A lone shepherd, weather-beaten and hunched, greeted them with wary eyes. His voice cracked with suspicion as he directed them to a crumbling chapel deep within the wetlands. There, he claimed, nightly chants rose like smoke into the fog, and strange lights flickered like stars drowned in the mire. Father Miquel knew the signs, heresy cloaked in secrecy. They made camp nearby, the fire flickering low as the damp closed in around them. That night, Miquel dreamt of blood swirling in chalices, of laughter echoing from unseen mouths, and vines wrapping tightly around the bones of forgotten saints. He awoke drenched in sweat, his crucifix clenched in trembling fingers. The following evening, under a sky bruised by the coming storm, Miquel and Arnaud crept through the reeds. There, in the clearing where the chapel leaned sideways like a drunkard, they saw them. Dozens cloaked in white linen, faces veiled, hands lifted in silent ecstasy. A woman, wild-haired and barefoot, led the gathering. Her voice, honeyed and eerie, rose in hymns that twisted the air with forbidden beauty. Miquel's breath caught. He watched as the group passed a chalice from lip to lip, their bodies swaying in rhythm to a song only they heard. It was not a parody of Mass. It was something older, something primal. They waited until dawn. At first light, the Inquisitor entered the chapel alone, his steps firm against the stone. The remnants of the gathering had vanished like mist, but their scent lingered, wine, myrrh, and sweat. On the altar, the chalice remained, and within it, a single crimson rose bloomed. Beneath the altar cloth, parchment lay inked with verses that spoke of divine union through nature's cycles and the holy intoxication of surrender. Miquel's hands trembled not from fear, but recognition. Long ago, in the Pyrenean valleys, he had burned a village for such rites. Villagers who claimed the Virgin came to them not in visions, but in the flesh of blooming vines. He remembered their songs still. This time, he did not order flames. Instead, he carried the parchments back to camp and studied them by lantern glow, night after night. Each word seemed to peel back a layer of his certainty, and each verse invited not rebellion but reflection. Arnaud watched his master grow quieter, his prayers longer, and his gaze more distant. 3 weeks passed. Finally, Miquel summoned the villagers to the chapel, not to accuse, not to condemn, but to listen. He read from the parchments, his voice calm, his eyes closed. The villagers wept, not from guilt but recognition. And for the first time in years, Father Miquel did not feel like a judge, but a man among men. But the courier returned. The Archdiocese had learned of his delay, of his silence, of the lack of names, of the absence of punishment. A second letter came, this one unsigned but unmistakable in its tone. It did not ask, it demanded. Purge, cleanse, destroy. Mikkel stood alone beneath the chapel's ruined arch that night, gazing into the stars as wind whispered through the reeds. He felt the weight of all he had done in the name of salvation, and in that moment, he chose. He wrote a single letter. In it, he confessed not guilt, but doubt, not weakness, but change, and then he vanished. Some say he died in the marshes, taken by spirits of the vine. Others claim he wandered south, joining a group of pilgrims who sang old songs to ancient skies. But within the Abbey of Saint Martial, a single rose now grows against the eastern wall. No one planted it, no one tends it, yet it blooms, crimson and defiant, each spring. And Arnaud, now an old man himself, tends it daily. For in that rose lies the echo of a choice, that mercy, even in the most brutal of lives, is not a betrayal. It is the beginning of peace. The spring that followed Father Mikkel's disappearance was unlike any the marshes had known. The skies, though often heavy with rain, seemed somehow softer. The earth, long trampled by fear and silence, awakened in colors once thought forgotten. Lavender crept across the chapel's stones, wild thyme scented the breeze, and the villagers of Balak, who had once whispered behind closed doors, now gathered freely beneath the mossy arches of the old chapel, speaking prayers not in Latin but in song. It was Brother Arnaud who remained, though the title brother no longer carried weight among the villagers. They simply called him Arnaud, keeper of the garden and the rose. He had not followed Mikkel when he vanished, nor had he sent word to the bishops. Something in him had changed that last night, when he found Mikkel standing still as a monument, gazing into the sky, his hands open and empty. That moment, quiet as snowfall, was a passing of the torch, not of office, but of understanding. For weeks afterward, Arnaud had struggled. The doctrine he once memorized with flawless discipline now felt brittle, like old parchment touched by flame. He still prayed, but his words no longer came from the pages of approved books. They rose from memory and pain, from longing and love. He had known no other life than that of service and silence. And now, alone in a village reborn, he was uncertain of his place. But the villagers welcomed him not as a remnant of fear, but as a witness to something greater. One morning, as the mist still clung to the earth like a lover unwilling to part, a girl approached Arnaud in the chapel garden. She was no older than 12, with tangled hair and eyes the color of sunlit moss. Her name was Isabelle, and she carried a small wooden box. She said little, but placed the box on the stone beside the blooming rose and opened it without ceremony. Within lay a bundle of old letters, faded, crinkled, and bound with twine, and a thin strip of blue silk. Arnaud lifted the first letter gently, careful not to tear the delicate script. It was addressed to Mikkel. The handwriting was delicate, elegant, and unmistakably feminine. The ink had faded, but the emotion it bore remained vivid. To you who sees the world in shadow and flame, I beg you, remember the light once held in your hands. It spoke of a woman named Aliénor, a healer from the mountains of Auvergne, who had known Mikkel before the robe, before the confessions, before the trials. Her letters painted not a romance, but a bond, one forged in the fires of shared grief. Arnaud read each one by candlelight that evening, and by the time the final page fell from his hand, his heart was no longer burdened by the weight of duty, but lifted by the quiet grace of memory. Mikkel had once been loved, not merely feared or revered, but known. That love had not died. It had simply waited, in letters unread, in roses unbloomed. The next morning, Arnaud took the letters to the villagers and read them aloud. Each word carried the timbre of a man who once judged, but learned to listen. And the people wept, not in sorrow, but in thanksgiving, for the Inquisitor who had once come with fire had instead left them with light. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm took root. The chapel, though never restored, became a sanctuary not for penance, but for gathering. The altar was no longer a place of fear, but of stories. The villagers brought tokens, herbs, painted stones, scraps of song, and placed them there, offerings to no single god, but to the spirit of remembrance. Arnaud began keeping a journal, something Mikkel had once forbidden. His entries were slow, hesitant at first, but grew with each passing moon. He wrote of the seasons, of the garden, of Isabelle's laughter, and the tales of old Aliénor. He wrote of his dreams, a fire that warmed rather than consumed, of stars that sang instead of judged. Yet word of peace travels as swiftly as rumor, and not all ears welcomed such tidings. One summer morning, a stranger appeared at the edge of the marshes. He wore the robes of a Dominican, black as night, his hood drawn low. He called himself Father Tabard, and he bore a writ sealed with the red wax of the ecclesiastical court. His orders were clear: investigate the disappearance of Inquisitor Miquel and report on the conduct of one brother Arnaud. The villagers grew silent once more. Thibault was younger than Miquel had been, but harder in gaze and leaner in mercy. His presence chilled the garden, and the rose, once blooming with defiance, drooped under his passing shadow. He questioned the villagers not with kindness, but precision, each word a scalpel, each silence an accusation. When he summoned Arnaud, he did not sit nor offer bread. He simply asked, "Did you lead the people astray?" And Arnaud, his hands folded and calm, replied, "No, I simply followed where another dared not finish." Thibault narrowed his eyes. "You speak in riddles." Arnaud gave a small, weary smile. "No, I speak in memory." That evening, Thibault took the letters, Aliénor's writings, and the journal Arnaud had kept. He confiscated the chalice found in the chapel and marked the garden for inspection. The villagers protested, but he silenced them with a glare owned by decades of training. He promised he would return to Bourges with his report, but he did not. 2 nights later, he vanished from his room at the inn. His belongings remained untouched. His horse was found at dawn, wandering the edge of the marsh, reins torn free. Some claimed they saw lights in the reeds that night, soft, golden, dancing like fireflies. Others whispered that Thibault had walked into the chapel, read a final letter, and simply wept. No one searched too long, and Arnaud, who said nothing, returned to his garden and tended the rose. For peace, once tasted, rarely lets go of the soul it chooses. And in the hush of the chapel, between prayer and silence, the villagers came to believe, not in fear, nor in dogma, but in the quiet revolution of mercy. End of part 19. Autumn arrived with a hush, drawing a golden veil over the marshlands. The reeds swayed like slow dancers, their brittle edges brushing the still waters beneath a sky soft as parchment. Leaves, touched with ochre and russet, fell in gentle spirals across the chapel's roofless remains, and in the garden behind the altar, the single crimson rose still bloomed, proud and defiant against the creeping chill. Arnaud had grown thinner with the season, but not from illness. His days were long with labor and reflection, and his nights filled with dreams that felt more vivid than memory. In one such dream, Miquel stood beside the old altar, clad not in the robes of judgment, but in a traveler's cloak, face lined with peace. He said no words, but extended a hand to Arnaud, offering a folded letter. Each morning after, Arnaud would sit by the rose and write, not as record, but as offering. His pages were filled with quiet thoughts, of the weight of silence, of forgiveness shaped like petals, of voices that once trembled, now learning to sing. The villagers had come to know peace as one knows the smell of hearth smoke or the sound of church bells, familiar and constant. They still gathered weekly, but now they brought not only offerings, but stories, tales of lost kin found again, of disputes resolved without rancor, of dreams that guided their hands during the harvest. Isabelle, now taller and surer of step, had become the heart of those gatherings. Her voice, clear as morning frost, led their hymns. Her laughter was the first heard each day near the chapel walls, and her hands, skilled beyond her years, tended not just the garden, but the sick, the elderly, and the broken-hearted. She often sat with Arnaud in the twilight, asking questions that bore the simplicity of youth, but the weight of wisdom. One evening, as they watched the reeds dance in the breeze, she asked, "Was he afraid? Father Miquel, I mean, when he left?" Arnaud took a long breath. The memory was distant now, blurred at its edges, but the feeling remained. "Yes," he said softly, "but not of punishment. I think he feared that he had only just begun to understand the truth and feared there would be no time to live it." Isabelle was quiet a moment, then nodded, as if storing the thought away for some later season of her own. But peace, like all sacred things, must be protected. One evening, as the sun bled low over the horizon, 2 travelers arrived. Clad in plain robes and heavy cloaks, they bore no sigils, no tokens of authority, but there was a sharpness in their gaze that spoke of discipline. They did not introduce themselves as Inquisitors, nor did they ask questions of sin. They merely said they had heard of a garden where roses bloomed in defiance of frost. Arnaud greeted them with his usual calm, offering water and bread. He saw at once that they were not strangers to hardship. Their hands bore the calluses of toil, and one of them limped faintly, favoring an old injury. Yet their eyes moved with purpose, tracking every gesture, every word. They stayed for 3 days. They watched the villagers, listened to their songs, sat through the evening gatherings. One morning, Arnaud found the taller of the two, whose name was Benoit, kneeling by the rose, his fingers just inches from its thorny stem. His expression was unreadable. "You see something?" Arnaud asked gently. Benoit looked up, not startled, but slow with thought. "I see a thing that should not grow here," he said, "and yet it does." Arnaud simply nodded. Not all life obeys the rules we write. Benoit rose, brushing his knees. "Do you believe it's a sign?" Arnaud considered the question, then answered, "I believe it's a response." That night, the two travelers left without farewell. But the next morning, at the edge of the chapel, a small token had been placed. A carved wooden emblem in the shape of a vine, curled into the letter M. Beneath it, a folded scrap of parchment. Some truths cannot be burned. Word of the marshes continued to travel, but now in hushed awe rather than suspicion. Pilgrims came not in droves, but in gentle streams. Seekers, the broken, the uncertain. They came not for relics, but for stories, for the warmth of fire shared without price, for the quiet affirmation that faith need not roar to be real. The villagers welcomed them as kin. Bread was broken, stories exchanged, and laughter once foreign now became a second language. No coin passed hands, only songs and silences. Isabel began recording the names of those who came, not as census, but as memory. Each name was written with care on vellum salvaged from the abbey's old stores, and beside each a single word offered by the traveler themselves: hope, peace, home, mercy. Arnaud, now slow in step but steady in heart, watched it all with a quiet pride. He no longer saw himself as a remnant of Mikel's past, but as a bridge between what was judged and what was forgiven. And in the garden, the rose was no longer alone. Without warning or design, 2 more roses bloomed beside it, one white, one gold. No hand had planted them. No plan had expected them. But the earth had listened. And in the hush of that chapel garden, beneath skies that whispered songs of endings and beginnings, Arnaud finally understood what Mikel had once feared losing. It was not power, nor penance, nor even absolution. It was the simple right to change. Winter returned not as a tyrant, but as a weary guest. Snow blanketed the marshes in quiet waves, covering the reeds in white lace and muffling the world into silence. The once muddy paths to the chapel lay frozen and pale, gleaming under the soft light of a pale sun. The villagers moved slower, their songs quieter now, their voices tempered by the weight of cold and memory. Fires burned longer in their hearts, and smoke curled steadily into the gray sky. Arnaud felt the season deep in his bones. His steps had grown short, his breath shallower, but his spirit remained unshaken. He moved about the chapel each morning with ritual simplicity, checking the roses now blanketed in burlap for warmth, brushing snow from the stone benches, and lighting the lantern by the altar. Each act felt sacred, not because of doctrine, but because of love. Isabel remained by his side as the days grew shorter. She had become a woman now, though no one could say precisely when the change had taken root. Her gaze was clear and watchful, her hands confident. She bore her quiet authority, not with pride, but with a serenity that made even the elders pause to listen when she spoke. Arnaud had taken to calling her Keeper, and though she always smiled and rolled her eyes, the name stayed. One frost-bitten morning, as the wind moaned low across the marsh, a raven arrived. It circled thrice above the chapel, then settled atop the broken bell tower, its feathers dusted with snow. Around its leg was tied a thin ribbon, and from it hung a folded piece of vellum. Isabel climbed the tower to retrieve it, her boots crunching over ice. The message was brief. In the quiet of your garden, a truth has taken root. We watch not with suspicion, but with reverence. The council will not return. Let the roses bloom. There was no seal, no signature, but the parchment bore the unmistakable scent of old sanctuaries, incense, wax, and faint myrrh. Arnaud, upon reading it, said nothing. He merely closed his eyes and exhaled a breath he had not known he was holding. It had taken a lifetime for peace to be acknowledged. That night, the villagers gathered in the chapel for what had become their ritual of warmth and memory. Lanterns flickered on every ledge, and blankets were passed among those who came with bare arms. Children sat cross-legged before the altar, while the elders leaned into each other for warmth and companionship. Isabel stood and recited the names recorded in her vellum book, not as a reading, but as a chant. Each name floated upward like a prayer. Each word the travelers had spoken was echoed back into the walls, into the stones, into the bones of the earth itself. Hope, mercy, return. Arnaud did not speak that evening. He simply sat beneath the blooming rose and listened. His eyes, though dulled with age, gleamed with the soft light of fire and memory. Later, as the chapel emptied and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, Isabel knelt beside him. She took his hand, withered warm, and placed within it a small object wrapped in linen. He unfolded it carefully. Within was a ring, not of gold or silver, but of carved wood, simple, worn, and old. The same ring Miquel had once worn before he had taken his vows. The same ring Isabel had once found near the altar years ago, hidden behind a stone loose in the floor. "It's time," she said, her voice a murmur of wind. Arnaud nodded. The following morning, he asked Isabel to summon the villagers. They came in silence, braving the frost with cloaks drawn tight, curiosity stirring behind their cautious eyes. Arnaud stood slowly before them, his breath visible in the cold air. He wore the old ring on his finger, and in his other hand, he held Miquel's journal, the last copy, preserved in beeswax cloth and bound with care. "I have told many stories in this place," he began, voice brittle yet steady. "Some of them were mine, some were Miquel's, some belonged to the earth itself. But one thing I have learned above all else is that truth is not a weapon, it is a garden." He paused, letting his words take root. "We once came here to seek punishment, then we sought peace. But now we must plant." From the folds of his robe, he drew a pouch of seeds, wild rose, lavender, sage. He handed them to the villagers one by one, and together, in the frozen soil near the chapel's eastern wall, they began to dig. They planted not just flowers, but remembrance. Each handful of earth turned was a vow, to live gently, to listen fully, to judge less and love more. As the last seed was pressed into the soil, Arnaud smiled, not at the work nor the gathering, but at something beyond. That night, as snow began to fall in soft flakes over the marshes, he sat once more beneath the rose. He did not sleep. He simply closed his eyes, and for a long while breathed. And when the morning came, he did not wake. Isabel found him as the sun rose pale and slow. His hands rested on his lap. The journal lay open beside him. The rose above him shimmered with frost. The villagers buried him beneath the chapel floor, in a grave marked only with a wooden carving of a rose and a single word, mercy. The wind through the reeds that day sang not of endings, but of return. End of part 21. Spring returned with a gentleness that seemed born from sorrow. The thaw came slowly, as though unwilling to disturb the quiet reverence that had settled over the marshes. Snow receded in hushed drifts, revealing the tender shoots of new life beneath, the earliest crocus, the sleepy green of wild mint, and the resilient petals of the first rose. Where once Arnaud had tended the garden with care and ceremony, now it was Isabel who knelt among the earth, her hands knowing, her touch kind. She wore no robes, bore no title, and yet within the hearts of the villagers and the passing pilgrims, she was keeper, guide, and witness. The chapel, though still broken in stone, stood whole in spirit. Its crumbling arches echoed laughter once more, and its shadow sheltered not sorrow, but hope. The bench where Arnaud had so often sat remained untouched, and each morning, Isabel would place a single rose upon it, a ritual, not of grief, but of remembrance. Travelers continued to arrive. Some stayed only a night, others lingered through seasons. They came from highland villages, from coastal towns, from cities where the name Inquisition still stirred unease. Each came with their own burden, and each left something behind, a word, a story, a seed. Isabel began recording not only names, but the tales that came with them. She listened without judgment, writing by lantern light in the quiet hours of night. The vellum book grew thick, its margins filled with sketches, with pressed herbs, with prayers written in every tongue she had learned. She called it the Garden of Memory. Among the visitors was a monk from Navarre, old and bent, who had once served under a tribunal in Toulouse. He came not with authority, but repentance. He spoke of names once erased, of families scattered, of flames that had stolen more than heresy. They had stolen language, song, and the right to remember. Isabel sat with him for 3 days, and when he wept, she wept with him. Another visitor was a woman cloaked in ash-colored wool, who arrived in silence and stayed through the rain. She spoke only once, to say that she had been a child when Father Miquel passed through her village, and that her mother had hidden her behind a wall when the questioning began. She remembered his voice. She remembered the fear. And she came now, not for vengeance, but for understanding. At her departure, she left behind a carved cross of birchwood and a lock of her daughter's hair, wrapped in blue silk. Each offering was placed near the altar, not as relic, but as testament. The chapel, over time, came to resemble a shrine not of dogma, but of memory. Dried flowers hung from its beams, and bells woven of straw and silver thread chimed in the wind. The altar, once bare and cold, now bore baskets of herbs, candles of beeswax, and bowls filled with seeds yet to be sown, and in the heart of the garden the roses bloomed. There were now 12. Each bore a color unlike the last: crimson, ivory, gold, dusk purple, even one the hue of storm clouds before rain. They formed a circle around Arnau's resting place, petals turned always to the east, to the first light of day. Isabel tended them with the same hands that once held parchment and prayer. She spoke to them, not in incantation, but in gratitude. For they had grown not from doctrine, nor from penance, but from the quiet courage of those who chose love over fear. One morning, as dew still clung to the petals, she found a scroll tucked between the chapel stones. It bore a familiar seal, an olive branch, once used by the lost Brotherhood of St. Elian, an order thought dissolved decades before. The letter was brief. We have watched, we have learned, we now remember. Beneath it, a list of names of former inquisitors, bishops, scholars, monks, each one followed by a place and a pledge to build gardens, to open libraries, to restore forgotten songs. They had been scattered, yes, but not broken. Isabel added the scroll to her book, and that night the villagers danced. It was not a festival born of tradition, but of the moment. Children spun in circles, women embroidered each other's shawls with threads of fire-bright hue, and old men told stories of days when the sky seemed farther away. Lanterns floated on the marsh, small and flickering, carrying whispered prayers for those who had once walked in shadow. In the final hour, as stars crept into view, Isabel stood before the altar. She wore no crown, no badge, only a simple cloak woven with rose vines. She opened the Garden of Memory and began to read, not as a priest nor a scribe, but as a daughter of what had come before. She read of Miquel's final winter, of Arnau's quiet courage, of every name spoken and every truth buried and unearthed. Her voice was clear, and with each word the wind seemed to still. Birds quieted. Even the marsh stood attentive. When she closed the book, no applause followed, only a silence so complete, so holy, that it felt as though the earth itself were holding breath. And then a child stepped forward, barefoot, bright-eyed, and placed a 13th rose upon Arnaud's grave, a wild rose, uncultivated, free, and Isabel smiled. Because she understood then, at last, that the Inquisition had not ended in fire, nor in judgment, nor in silence. It had ended in a garden, where roses bloomed in defiance of frost, where mercy outlived memory, where love grew roots so deep, no doctrine could pull it free. And as the stars turned above, slow and eternal, the wind carried the last word of the story not into the past, but into bloom. End of 22.